Welcome to the Supported Living Property Podcast with your host, me, Lisa Brown, the place to learn about supported living property investing. Hi Simon, it's great to have you here today. For people who don't know you, would you introduce yourself and tell people a little bit about you?
Oh, thanks, Lisa. Yes. So my name's Simon Duffy, and I never know quite what job title to give myself. I run something called Citizen Network, and I think I'm a strange mixture of social activist and philosopher.
Fabulous. That sounds
And
like a great introduction. So how did you end up doing what you're doing now, I guess?
yeah, so well, it's been a very long journey, and it's kind of there've been several chapters. I'm old enough to have multiple chapters in my life now, for better or worse. And but it kind of began in 1988 when I visited an institution. I was called I think you're a proper nurse. I was. You'll remember these characters, the NHS General Management Trainee, and so I I was on the what's called the Cook's Tour and visiting all the different aspects of the NHS, and I visited this institution down in East Sussex, and I was kind of horrified by it, and I was kind of rather amazed by the wonderful people who were incarcerated in it. And really at that stage, I kind of found myself wanting to make my life's purpose about helping people get out of those kind of places. And I really, through the 90s, I worked on very practical things around doing that in London and then later in Scotland in some very radical ways that people hadn't really done before. And then in the 2000s, I led a project called In Control, and introduced the concept of personal budgets into social policy. And then from 2009 onwards, I've been really in this kind of think tank role of trying to spread ideas and network people. And that over time became Citizen Network. So sorry, I sandwiched rather too much in there.
No, it's amazing. Such diverse stuff, but like you say, all that's led you to where you are now and the work that you're doing now. So going right back to that first experience, how old were you when you went to that institution? Because that sounds like that was a really pivotal moment for you.
Yeah, I think it was 23.
Right.
It was absolutely, it was that point where, um, if you're a believer, you find out what God wants you to do. That's like, you're just like, yeah, absolutely pivotal. And the memories from that time haven't left me really. And they're not all negative memories, although the place was terrible, but the memory of feeling like these amazing folk didn't belong in a place like this. And why had I got to the age of 23 and I'd never met anybody with a disability, never mind a complex learning disability. And so, yeah, that sense of shock, but also kind of the positive sense that there's something beautiful here that's missing, which would be people's inclusion, was just, yeah, very, very transformative for me.
That's really interesting because for a lot of people, it was just was such a taboo subject. People didn't talk about it, think about it. Like you said, it wasn't commonplace to meet people. And so I think for a lot of people, they'd have just gone. I'm sure there are other people on your training program who just went, yeah, right, I'll just turn away, not think about that again. Thank you. So what did you end up doing from there?
So I got a secondment. I completed my traineeship, but at the end of the traineeship, you could get a secondment, and I got a secondment into an organisation called Southwark Consortium, which was actually it's still going now, and today it's called Choice Support. So it's now one of the larger service providers for people with learning disabilities. But at that time, it was an innovative model to provide housing for people coming out of the first institution to close in the UK, which was Downth Park Hospital, which was in Kent. So people were coming back to the different parts of London that they or their family lived in. And Southwark was set up as, I think it was the pioneering consortium model. The model doesn't exist anymore. It was interesting because it was a combination of the NHS, the local authority, and 3 housing associations, if I remember correctly. And then they created the housing stock, and they then used the board and lodging system. If some not everybody will be old enough to remember what that was, but that was a entitlement to housing effectively created under Thatcher, um, which was, I mean, in many ways exploited, but in this case, it was used quite productively to get people out of institutions. So it combined housing costs and support costs. Um, and there was a kind of like a money laundering system, really. So it was subsidizing NHS and local authority costs from this rental element, and then there were other details. But then there was this big change in 1990. The Community Care White Paper came out, and then in 92 the legislation changed. And actually, so the consortium, and I was part of this, we took on all the NHS services. So it was actually effectively a huge privatisation, although, you know, arguably it was actually a good privatisation, that really the NHS wasn't an appropriate support provider, I think, for people living in the community. And so, you know, set up as a charity to provide support services to people. So it's a model we're now very familiar with, but it is, yeah, it was quite a breakthrough model. And I got involved in, my job title was Service Development Officer, which kind of meant I just had to solve problems we didn't really know how to solve, which was quite a good job to have. So I had
Yeah.
to help design the whole transfer process, but I also had to help create new services for people. Like we created a support tenancy, and I said, "What's a support tenancy?" "Oh, we don't know. We think it's." So we had to create this model of somebody living with some or two men with learning disabilities and a third man who was a support tenant. And so this is all very new in the early 90s. Nobody had really tried out these models before. Um, and over time, I guess one of the things that really struck me was a tension between some of the values that people expressed quite wholeheartedly around inclusion and human rights, but then the reality of the system didn't always really live up to that. Um, you know, so people didn't have real control and power over their services, so that led me into exploring things like individual funding, but also people didn't really have control over their housing situation. So they were put into group homes. And again, by the standard of the times, these were high quality group homes, ordinary streets, three, four, five people living together. This is,
So just what we would think of now as an HMO, like a shared house, really.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. So this was an innovative model then, but you started to see that what you were doing really was we were just saying, oh well, it's convenient for us if you five people live together, even if you hate each other. Or, and in fact, if one person starts to get really upset and maybe act out how upset they are, well, we'll just start moving people around. But we're now moving people around a finite number of boxes that we've decided are houses for people with learning disabilities in Southwark, if you know what I mean.
Right. Yeah.
And so we started, so me and some friends said, well, why don't we just help people live in their own home? And
Hmm.
and then we don't have, and then we separate out the housing and support. And so that became a thing which became known as supported living in that kind of early 90s period.
Amazing. And so and being able to see that and see that happen firsthand and experience that almost like mini institutions being created to start with by the sounds of it, taking people out of one large one into a series of smaller institutions, but then supporting people to transition on. Yeah. And
That's exactly it, Lisa. And that's, you know, the power of the institution in a sense is it's hard to shake the mental stranglehold it has over you. Like, so that,
as
so
a professional, do you mean, or as a tenant or a person?
well, a professional particularly,
Yeah.
tenants,
Yeah.
people, there is some institutionalization, but I think it was always a miracle that however long people had stayed in, people could find that life again. You know, it's a natural human thing. It sometimes takes time and support, uh, but yeah, just the assumption that we know best, the assumption that we're in control, the assumption that we're the ones managing the situation. That in a way is the nub of the institution, really. It's not the buildings, it's the
Mm,
assumption of power and control over other people. That's
mm.
hard to let go. It's hard to let go, not for reasons of badness, I think, but you there's just this assumption that it's your job to make people's lives better. That was actually the assumption that, in a way, drove people into the institution sometimes, even when they become something much more horrible. They often started with that assumption, and that can continue. And this focus on, we'll organise things so you're happy. We'll organise things so you've got a good life. But all you do all the time is you forget that, but it's their life. They're a unique individual with their own will and spirit, and yes, like everyone, we all need help, but you can't decide how to organize everything for somebody. You have to allow a life to evolve, um, that is truly that person's life. Yeah.
And it's not always neat and tidy. And I think particularly, my background's as a general nurse, the traditional general nursing is very much we're in charge. We'll make your bed neat and tidy, and we'll, don't mess up that old fashioned kind of don't mess up the bed, sit there neatly, and don't crease your pajamas. I know that's a little bit before my time, but that whole kind of approach of that still is there in the NHS very much, isn't it? That kind of approach to things. So the fact that actually letting people have their own say and opinions isn't always comfortable, is it? It's quite difficult sometimes because maybe you have got experience of where that's going to go wrong. And it's like, I suppose it's a little like parenting young adults and teenagers, isn't it? You kind of have to watch them make mistakes as well and let people learn their own way and do their own thing.
Yes, I think
Parenting
people.
sounds patronizing there, but I guess that's me taking that
No, but
role.
I
But
think it's interesting to. I think that people worry about applying that metaphor, but I actually think it is quite a helpful metaphor, and it's actually a kind of helpful metaphor for all our relationships. Actually, if we think about our relationship to a child, we're just really thinking about the true nature of love,
mm,
and love has got a concern for the well-being of the person, but it has a primary concern for the, if you like, the development of the person as a person. And you know that very sharply when you have a child. So I don't think it is inappropriate to to think about what we can transfer from that fundamental human experience. And I think that when I think about the work that we did, particularly in the later 90s when I was helping people get out of institutions, so we were supporting people who were often described as the most challenging people in the institution because I set up this organization called Inclusion Glasgow. Nobody had ever done this before, where everything was individualized. So you chose your own home. If you wanted to live on your own or with your partner or with some friends, that's fine. Most people chose to live on their own or with a partner. People were not choosing group homes that we were supporting. Um, you would have your own support team, your own budget, your own life. And because we were doing it in such an individualized way, I didn't think about this, so I'm not very smart. Actually, the institution gave us all the people who were really complex and wouldn't go neatly into the group homes. The people that they would be spending £200,000 a year on in some ATU, we were being asked to support for £39,000 a year. And so you had to learn very quickly how to think creatively, how to think about independence respectfully, but also to recognize there are times when you have to manage independence and it isn't a straightforward thing. You do have to keep an eye on not only the person's safety, but the safety of other people as well. And that is the responsible thing to do. So, I don't think the deinstitutionalization or getting rid of those kind of structures shouldn't lead us into a kind of carelessness with other people's lives. Like we all have to take care of each other and we all have to
Mm,
attend to important details which vary from individual to individual. And just as you say, with
mm,
a child, you want them to be the best that they can be. That's what your job as a parent is. But it's because in a way that's just an extreme form of really what our attitude to all of us should be, isn't it?
yeah.
It's not
Yeah.
because it's an inappropriate attitude. It's just that with our child, it's very focused. But really, everybody needs to be the best that they could be.
Yeah, absolutely. And a good community supports everybody to be that, to be
Exactly.
that, I guess. So from that viewpoint when you were, you were so heavily involved in supporting people to come out of institutions and coming up with innovative ways for people to live independently or as independently as they could with the support they needed. How does that feel looking back now, looking at what we're seeing now, where we're still seeing people, yeah, they're not big institutions as those ones that we're thinking of with big Victorian houses, but we're still seeing a lot of people stuck in hospitals, in ATUs, aren't we? I think current figures are over 2,000, aren't they? We're talking about people with learning disabilities
Yeah.
and autism. Did you, I suppose, from you in the 90s, did you think this problem would be solved, or did you think we would still be here this far ahead?
Um, no, that's a good question. I actually, it was very live even then, because actually, if you want to go back to the source of the kind of ATU, private institutional care, you actually, the best place to start is looking at what happened in that very first wave of hospital closure programs. And I wasn't involved in that in England, but I had colleagues who were senior nurses and very, who could see what was going on. And roughly speaking, what I think has happened is that the in that early stage of English deinstitutionalization, some people were deemed as to be too complex. There was no equivalent to Inclusion Glasgow. There was no real individualized, personalized support on offer. And some of the charge nurses in the hospitals offered to basically set up mini institutions for those folk. And over time, what has happened is those have been bought up by big business, really. So
Mm.
that's become a whole kind of profitable sideshow. Most people did leave the big institutions, did move into largely rather institutional community solutions, which then generate their own negative consequences. So then generate kind of ongoing demand for these more institutional services because people are cross and angry that they're forced to live away from their family, away from their community, with people they hate, with people who are attacking them. And so you get these horrible cycles created. I met with families who had their kids in Winterbourne View as part of a research project we ran. And what those families told me was two depressing things, really. One was Winterbourne View was the least bad place their kids had been, which is a pretty,
That's damning,
and
isn't it?
yeah.
Yeah,
And then the
yeah.
second thing was that every family had the same story of what had happened, which was basically a little bit of help, a little bit of flexibility at a critical time, and their son or daughter would never have even left home. But instead of that, they were put into a group home. And then when they got upset at the group home, they were put into a more institutional group home, even further away from their home. And then a series of those events happened until they ended up in the £200,000 a year institution. So the failures are kind of systemic. You've created this institution, that's a failure. So you've created a place you can put people. You've then created a kind of cascade of failure by your over institutional services and failure to offer people personalised support. And we fail to provide preventative support to families to begin with. So, and just to top it off, we then create these perverse incentives. So when the local authority passes control to the NHS, it loses its natural incentive to get people back because it's now got the NHS paying for it. And the NHS does the same, gets regional NHS to pay for looks and blah. So it's a very systemic problem. In a way, it's not. We know how to solve it because we know how to do all of those things better. But maybe that's the sad thing is that the will to tackle that problem just doesn't seem to exist. Nevertheless, you'll get senior politicians throwing money at it and talking enthusiastically about their commitment, and yet they won't address any of the obvious systemic issues. So I don't know. I think it was a pretty knotty problem even in the early 90s. In the period of the Valuing People White Paper in the 2000s, some of us were lobbying to make that an issue, to close these places, but the leadership at the time thought that that was not the priority. They wanted to close the old institutions, but not these new ones.
Right.
That was a bit of a missed opportunity, but perhaps only because at that time there was at least some leadership around people with learning disabilities. Once that leadership's gone, really, since 2010, we've just been in this kind of weird, yeah, rather hopeless situation of central government washing its hands of all responsibility in this place, because actually it's creating the problems by its cuts to local government and to social care,
Mm.
but it doesn't want to take responsibility for the consequences of that either. Sorry, that was a
No, no, no,
long response.
it's really interesting, and I think it's really relevant to the conversations that are being had today, isn't it? And I think that historical perspective that you can bring, Simon, is really adds some depth to that conversation, because I think it's a continued frustration for people, isn't it, that we have so many people stuck in hospital and assessment and treatment units, and and why that is. And when you think about that research that you did about Winterbourne View, then actually perhaps getting the right support in, and that's going to not be expensive, is it, at that point? And that could prevent a huge amount of public cost as well as the trauma to the families and the individuals involved. It's
Yeah, yeah. You have to kind of. It's like a machine. It's a machine for generating badness that we've
mm,
got in place. It is effectively a machine. You can see it at
mm,
work, and you have to disassemble the machine. We've done it because we did. There were many more thousands of people in these big institutions, and we did disassemble that. And you can disassemble the community group homes, and people can move into their own home and have all of those benefits. We know how to do these things, and we know that they're not more expensive, but they require change, they require leadership, they require kind of honest analytical approaches as well to some of these problems, not just grand statements, but you actually have to try and really understand what's going on.
mm. And on an individual level, it's going to be complex, isn't it, for each individual involved in the work that you were talking about doing in Glasgow? It's not a one size fits all for everybody, is it, at all?
No, no. I mean, I think the thing that I'm more disappointed in, I know as much as anything I'm disappointed in myself, is that the work around personalised support that we pioneered in the 90s and spilled over to some extent um, into the work that we were doing it in control around everybody having their own budget, that has not really gone forward in the way it should.
No,
The vision was certainly that the vast majority of people receiving social care should have their own personal budget, should be able to make their own decisions about where they live. And we just assumed, given the great data we had and the great momentum we had, that people would just go, well, yeah, obviously we want to do that. Why wouldn't, like support providers, why wouldn't we want to be providing support like that? Because it's better, it's more respectful, better concordance with human rights, just all those things. But actually, yeah, then you discover again that the system, the commissioning system, the social work system, the service provider regulatory system has kind of ossified. Like no, no, no. This is how you do things. You've basically taken what we invented in the 90s and you've turned it into the new system. So it is again the new institution. And even though, and again, it's a lot more subtle and it's not as malign in many areas, and you can have a better life in it than in the old institution. But really, it's pretty stuck in that way of thinking. And I mean, I was looking at the why commissioners. I wrote the guidance that went with the 2014 Care Act on individual service funds. And I went to different local authorities and asked them, why aren't you implementing individual service funds and personal budgets managed by providers? And we don't trust the providers, was their response. I go, but you're giving them all the money. It's not, it's not functional not to trust them.
So it wasn't they wouldn't trust individuals to manage the budget, it was the service providers they wouldn't
Yeah,
trust.
yeah. In
Oh,
fact, so direct
interesting.
payments, which is individuals managing it,
Yeah,
grew to probably I think it's even over what its proper level should be at about 20%. The other 80% really should be kind of managed personal budgets. If you're an older person or somebody with complex learning disabilities, somebody with a complex mental health problem, you're not going to be managing your own personal budget. You don't need
no,
the hassle.
no.
And you don't need to get the value you need of flexible personalized support. We already know how to do that without you having to take a direct payment and manage all the money yourself.
So who would be managing that in that case, Simon? Just if people are sitting here thinking, well,
So
how
the
does it
support
work?
provider would be the normal model. An individual service fund would. So what we did in Glasgow, Inclusion Glasgow, we received people's money. Actually, we received it in a block and we individualized it. But you could receive it as an individual budget. Say, right, this is Simon's money. And our job now is to work with Simon to design the best support for Simon. And we can subcontract, but we can also just employ staff. And when we employ staff, we'll employ them just for Simon.
Right.
So basically a personal assistant for Simon. And you can do all of that inside the kind of organizational envelope of, if you like, a traditional organization. You can have
Mm.
human resources and rights and responsibility, all of that, but you can do it all in a personalized way. There's a few organizations who have continued to take this forwards, and most of
Mm.
them are small organizations. There's a brilliant organization in the south of England called iDirect that's doing this. But a very large organisation that's done good work in this area is Enable, which is the Scottish version of MenCap. And they've taken the learning from Inclusion Glasgow and turned it into what they call the PA model. So if you get support from Enable, you actually get it on this kind of individual basis, but you don't have to manage your own budget.
Right. Perfect.
Um,
Yeah.
So, I mean, and that's what good support is primarily about, the quality of the relationship between the person and the person supporting them.
Mm.
So, you know, all of the CQC training, da 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 da. I mean, a lot of it I don't think makes much difference, to be honest. I probably shouldn't, people wouldn't like me saying that, but I really don't think, my experience is the relationship. If you recruit right at the beginning, and you give a bit of support and you check things are going okay. You need some checks and balances in there, but you'll be fine. And people want to do a good job, most people. So you have,
Mm.
and you won't catch out the bad ones through a training program or
No.
through CQC regulations. The best guarantee you have is that there are enough different people in that person's life so that corruption can't creep in.
Hmm.
Fundamentally, it's the relationship. People do not want to have support from somebody they don't like, somebody who doesn't get them, somebody who's not on the same wavelength as them. So you need to get the relationship right.
It's really key, isn't it? Is making sure that that person is someone that they're comfortable with, they know, and that's for everybody. And if you have, some support needs thrown in there as well, it becomes even more important, doesn't it, really?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, we all know this stuff really. It doesn't take much imagination to just put yourself in somebody's shoes and ask yourself, well, what would be important to you?
Mm.
If you needed help going to the toilet, what would be really important to you? If you needed help making friends, what would be really important? If you need help going out and about and doing stuff, imagine what would make that good and imagine what would make that bad. You can generalize, then you have to really listen to the individual and find out exactly what it is that makes them tick and get them to think about it. And then you can kind of match people and you can do people can spend some time together to find out if the chemistry's right. So you've got to change the whole recruitment process to be focused on the relationship. But it really does work.
And I guess it probably is good at retaining staff as well, because if the staff are happy and are building that good relationship with the individual that they're supporting, they're probably more likely to stay as well if they're feeling fulfilled and enjoying and valued and enjoying their job, because
I think so because exactly it's the same in reverse, isn't it? What were if you've got to get up in the morning and go to work, you want to go and spend it with somebody you want to spend time with, and also somebody that you probably feel some genuine responsibility for their
mm.
well-being and their safety. Um, One of the things that was really striking, Lisa, was when we were doing this work in Glasgow with the team would also be very conscious of what the person's budget was. Um, and people were very responsible because they knew that that really was Jack's money. If Jack made savings, we would use that to benefit Jack and sometimes Jack's team. But there was no extra money. Like we couldn't just invent money. So
No.
so everybody was very, very responsible and creative, and they were up for trying things out that would save Jack, Patrick money, even if sometimes that meant that maybe their job would change or that they would get fewer hours or something. People, I think, also want to be responsible. I think this is part of the one of the central themes of my work is that I think human beings want to be citizens in the sense that they want to be not just living for themselves, but living for the benefit of others and for the community. They want to have responsibilities and the status that comes from that. Everybody wants that, and a lot of what we do, not just to people with disabilities, but to staff, undermines that. It infantilizes people, and then that actually encourages the very behaviour you think you're trying to avoid.
Mm, absolutely. So you're saying about the work that you're doing now, Simon. Tell us a bit about what that is.
Yeah, well, from 2000 so after doing this work around individualization of support,
Mm,
then I started saying, well, how could we change the social work system so that that was its natural operating system? And that led into this world of self-directed support and personal budgets. And so I kind of invented a number of different approaches to try and make that a more universal one. Direct payments already existed. That was introduced by the Direct Payment Act of 1996, and there'd been an independent living movement going way back into the 60s, but largely that was very restricted to people with physical disabilities.
right.
So my mission in the early 2000s was really about extending that kind of principle of independent living to everybody receiving support. And by about 2009, I think the system had probably had enough of me. So I think I found myself in a situation where um, I'd lost a kind of chess match of power. I'd become seen as a problem. The government had adopted many of my ideas, but I think sometimes when that happens, that's not always a very good thing for your career because then you're seen as a little bit too. If you criticise what the government's doing or how they're implementing the ideas, that criticism is taken as having too much weight.
Right.
I ended up in a situation that was, yeah, personally quite difficult, and I left, and I after a bit of mourning and trying to work out what do I want to do next, I thought, well, what this is about in one level is trying to rethink what the relationship between the welfare state and citizens should really be.
Hmm.
And so I set up initially a think tank called the Centre for Welfare Reform. I thought this was a really clever idea, Lisa. It wasn't. It was not one of my best ideas by a long chalk because I thought, like, let's take an idea like welfare reform that's associated with right wing thinking and then show that it can't really be right wing because actually that's not how you make the world better.
No.
Let's try and make the word welfare reform mean reform, i.e., making things better. I kept losing this argument on Wikipedia. So I kept trying to redefine welfare reform, and it wouldn't let me. Uh, and uh, and I think that people just did kind of not quite understand what we were trying to do. And of course, then also when the 2010 government came in, these huge swathing cuts came in. So a lot of that period from 2010 to 2015 was taken up with fighting the cuts, researching the cuts, showing how unfair they were. But then in 2016, with the wisdom of my wife, she said, well, I think a lot of what you're positively doing, Simon, is you're helping people connect. And your work is really about citizenship. So why don't we kind of create this thing that's now called Citizen Network? So what's happened really is that the work has shifted into primarily trying to encourage new good ideas by sharing things for free. So there's loads of resources on our website, loads of things you can download. There's a community of fellows that we've created, 200 fellows from around the world. And you can join Citizen Network. It's got 6,000 members, and there's 350 organizations, I think, who are members. So we've created a kind of community to try and drive forward this different vision of the world, really. A world where everyone matters. That's our mission. So it's a bit mad, and um,
The very big picture thinking, isn't it? It's
Yeah,
Mm,
it's still rooted in those same things actually, but I think that when you look at the experiences of the people who are most marginalised, not just people with learning disabilities, but they are a great group to be thinking with. But you look at the experiences of women, you look at the
mm,
experiences of refugees, you look at the experiences of people facing different forms of discrimination. You realise that the conditions for justice require more than just statements of human rights and more than public services. We actually need to change the kind of quality of our community life together. And so a lot of the work these days is very focused on the idea of like what would a flourishing neighborhood look like? What would an inclusive community look like? How would we create those things? What are the roles of the law, of social security systems, of public services in creating that, but recognizing that they don't create it on their own? That the welfare state components merely move resources around, including expertise, but in helpful patterns. But ultimately, the work is done by us as citizens in our lives, in our own lives, and in the communities that we're part of. And you can't get away from that. You can't get justice on the cheap in a way. You can't get human rights for free. You have to do the work of it. And the good thing is it's not always painful. It's some of it's joyous, but it's challenging. It's different to just going along with the institution, I suppose.
mm, mm,
So yeah, in a sense, it's continuing to question what is an institution, where what its boundaries are, and yeah, trying to move away from. I think I felt like at some point going back to the supported living concept. It's the journey away from the institution, from big institution to small institution to having your own home, say, put it like that, is a positive journey, but it's not enough. Having your own home should be, so this is what's in the book Wendy and I wrote, one of the keys to citizenship. So it's important because it's one of the keys to citizenship. It roots you in a community. But to be a citizen, you need the other keys to citizenship. You need a life of meaning. You need freedom. You need some money in your pocket. You need help and you need to be giving other people help. You need to be living a life in community and contributing to your community. And you need love and all the relationships of love. So you need a much more multicolored, multidimensional vision, not just a service model. And actually, what's true for people with learning disabilities is actually true for absolutely every single one of us. So this is strangely turns out to be just shared universal work, if that makes sense.
hmm. Yeah, it does completely. So those are because your book is called Everyday Citizenship, isn't it? Is it Seven Keys to a Life Well Lived? Are
That's
they
it.
the
Sorry.
seven keys that you were talking about just
That's right.
now?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I
Um,
mean, the original work, the original concept came out of that Glasgow work, and I felt that, and I think your work probably tallies well with this because I was trying to get people to see, in a funny way, how easy doing the right thing is compared to doing the wrong thing. So there was a book that preceded this one just called The Keys to Citizenship, and that book was much less accessible, but it was written primarily for social workers and for families. It wasn't written so much for people with learning disabilities. The new book is very easy read, and it's slightly broader in its reference, but the original book was more like a kind of guide to practical things like how to get a home. And so it described things like how you would buy a home, why you might want to go to a private landlord, and it was basically saying, look, if you examine your housing options like just anybody else would,
mm,
the housing stock is the housing stock. What's probably most important to you is what neighborhood you live in. How close are you to your family and your friends or to work that you want to do?
mm,
So
mm,
then look at the housing in that area and find the right solution for you. Don't be told that you've got to live in this service or that service and with their
mm,
whatever limited options they have. So the book was trying to really offer very practical guidance and say that many of the things like renting a home or buying a home, these can be done. Like anybody can do them. Like there's no great mystique. The mystique actually becomes with the peculiar services, which you have to wait on a waiting list or keep lobbying social services to get into. But ordinary life presents ordinary opportunities.
Mm.
Yeah, you might need a bit of advice on how to, especially even more now, but how the benefit system works for housing and such like. But these are general rights that exist, and they exist for everybody, including people with learning disabilities.
And where do you think the future for where do you see the future going with this? I think, with that historical perspective that you can bring to it, where do you think this is going?
Well, I genuinely think we've reached a kind of crunch point where the the kind of movement for change that I'm just one little part of, which talked a lot about person-centeredness, inclusion, self-direction, different words like that. I think it's finally come to the point where it needs to fully embrace what it's the sense that those things can only really be true if the community functions more effectively. I think that there's always been this interesting kind of yin yang relationship, and in fact, if you look at the people who really gave birth to these ideas, I mean, people like John O'Brien and Judith Snow, who were the very very influential thinkers in this field. Um, they were also friends with people like John McKnight, who's really taking forward this asset-based community development approach, which is saying actually we need to start with community and think about how the strengths of the community can be um, opened up to ensure everybody can flourish. Yeah. So I think it's really we've got to put the two sides of that coin together now. I think that we won't get inclusive, welcoming communities just by wishing for them. I think we have
I was
to.
going to ask, how do we do that when we have, well, I had a situation, fairly recently with a property we were looking at developing where actually the neighbours found out that it was potentially going to be there. And we literally had sort of pitchforks at dawn in the community, and the local authority were like, no, we can't do it in that site, it's too sensitive.
Uh,
Um, you know, how do we change that kind of, I think a lot of it comes from fear and misunderstanding, but I'm sitting there as someone without, so I don't know.
No, well, I know that's true, isn't it? I mean, you're right,
Mm,
absolutely right, and it goes back to the fact that we haven't really seriously challenged some of the stereotypes that led to the creation of the institution in the first place. There's some things have softened a little bit, and there's
mm,
more visibility for people with learning disabilities certainly than there was um, 10, 20, certainly 30, 40 years ago. So I think there's been some progress on that, but it's still a problem. I think, I guess the way I see it is that it actually starts, and this might seem an odd starting point, but it starts by us taking seriously the concept of a neighborhood, of a community. It's a bit like, in a way, with citizenship, where you have to take seriously the idea that people are individuals with rights and freedoms, and you start with the individual and you build out from that. That's what the keys to citizenship does. But I think the same is true a bit with community. You actually have to say, well, this community needs to exist for real, and it needs to honour its responsibilities, which includes responsibilities to welcome and include. And that might seem like wishful thinking, but how else are we going to get there? Because otherwise, you're just in bossy boots land, and it's bossy boots
mm.
land that's creating a lot of the trouble. Like bossy boots land, which assumes the state knows best and can boss people around, but as you experience, often just runs away in fear itself.
Yeah,
What's it going to
yeah,
do?
yeah.
And unless we actually just take seriously the fact that we need small human scale communities where, and again in England, we're really out of touch with what's going on in the world. I think. I mean, what's happening in many countries is that countries are already organised or are starting to increasingly organise at a very small level, democratically. And people come together, problem solve together, do things together, make their community better together. How else are we going to tackle any of the problems we have, Lisa?
Mm,
I mean, are we going to sit around waiting for Keir Starmer to solve them?
mm.
Not looking like, or pick your favorite or least favorite politician.
Absolutely, put anyone's name in that picture.
Yeah,
Exactly.
exactly.
It's there's so many small scale problems that he's solving at community level, aren't there?
Yeah, and so
Big issues to that community, but too small for a prime minister or a leader of a country to be thinking of. Yeah.
exactly, and they're problems that, in a way, only a collective solution makes sense. So, in a sense, if the community itself doesn't learn how to take care of its members better, and if most members of that community don't take that seriously, then what kind of community is it? Like, if
Mm,
you even stick somebody in that community and say that, oh, a success, you've got a house in crap community number 633, you know what I mean? Like, that's the problem. If you turn the community simply into a place where you reside rather than a place where you enjoy your citizenship, a place where you're, on the one hand, you're just kind of put up with, to a place where people celebrate your participation. And that might seem a bit dreamy, especially because I think we spent decades forgetting that human beings need community.
mm,
But it's the only way out of this problem, I think. It's like you have to almost go directly to the goal. The goal is to create functioning, flourishing communities. Therefore, you need to have things like governance at that level. You'll need to have decision-making structures at that level. They don't need to look like traditional councils, I would suggest. They could be much more. A good thing about a small community is everybody can be included in the decision-making.
mm, mm,
Again, it won't magically solve every problem, but then you will have other things you can have, like you can have other protections for human rights, and you can do things that, I mean, I don't know how this seems to you, but I'm very interested in the perverse. This goes back to this institutionalization problem. At the moment, there's this perverse situation where if somebody causes a problem, and that's how people end up getting services, they're in crisis, they cause a problem,
mhm,
their family can't cope, blah, 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 then the first response of the system is to take that person out. And at that point, that the system starts spending money on them. It
mm,
starts effectively, if you think about it, it's spending the neighborhood's money on taking them out of the neighborhood.
mm,
So if you were to reverse the economic logic of the current welfare state, you'd say, well, actually, a functioning community is one where most of the nursing, the social work, the social care, the education stays inside the community. Like you want the talents to enrich themselves in that community. You want the resource, you want the spending to circle around the community. You want the relationships to grow in the community. Um, so in a way, deinstitutionalization of the welfare state would have been by putting much more attention into the places we live and making them all flourish. And in a funny way, because our whole system is designed the other way around, the good news is then we've got something to play with.
mm, mm,
I mean, you can look at this from a perspective not just of social care. I don't know, you may not agree with me on this, but education. It's like,
mm,
to me, it's weird how big schools have got. Like a primary school remains actually very close to a kind of perfect anchor institution. There's probably about as many primary schools as there are neighborhoods. And a primary school is a kind of community where most kids can know each other, and
mm, mm,
for some reason, and this is not a global norm, we just decided that when a kid gets to 11, we'll ship them all over the shop because they've got to go to something gigantic where they're just lost at sea,
mm.
supposedly so that they can get a proper education. But we live in a world with computers. We live in a world where your neighbors know as much as the teachers, to be honest. And
Yeah, yeah.
like the knowledge you need and the
Mm,
encouragement and support you need could all stay much, much more local. These giant schools, what interests are they really serving? They don't think they're serving the interests of the kids. I don't think they're serving the interests of the family. They're certainly not serving the interests of the neighborhood.
no.
So I think we could rethink a lot of the things we do and have much more fun. Nurses, as an ex-general nurse, they're crying out for more humane ways of working,
Mm,
closer to their community. Not, these are like clever, self-motivated, usually women, working in often very deathly bureaucracies.
Mm,
And
mm,
so there's a kind of global movement to get, like, let's get healthcare back to communities,
mm.
and let's give much more autonomy to professionals so that they can work in partnership with their communities instead of just operating in the system. Sorry, I've gone off on various
No,
types
it's so
here.
fascinating, and I think that it just is a really good reminder to everyone because we can so often sit in a oh this is just the way things are mindset, particularly when everyone's busy and you're just very used to a system. It's really hard sometimes to step outside that and challenge that and think actually why do we do things that way? And I think this conversation's been really powerful for that. And I think whatever you're doing in supported living, if you're listening to this podcast, you've got some interest in supported living from lots of different perspectives, because I know my audience is so mixed. And I think this conversation and the really great things that you've been sharing with us, Simon, is a really good reminder to us all to just stop and think a little bit about why things are happening the way they're happening, and actually are you part of that system, and can you do stuff to change things a little bit and improve things and think differently, really it's been a really powerful conversation. We'll put the link to your book, Simon, in the show notes so people can get a hold of you there, and your website and stuff, where you said there are some resources for people to access. Is there anything else that we should be saying at this point, Simon? Is there anything else you think we've missed to talk about?
No, but well, I'd say my one little thought for anybody who's listening is never underestimate the power of what you or somebody with learning disabilities can achieve. And so I see self-advocates now, particularly, waking up to their own citizenship, and we can all do this. So, it is easy to kind of sometimes drift along, but if you find something you're passionate about, you can make a difference in your community right now.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you for listening to this episode. If you're finding this content useful, then maybe it's time you join the Supported Living Property Network. If you're not already a member, then let me explain what's included. The network is a unique community of property investors and providers coming together to create quality supported living homes. If you're a property investor, you can list property on our portal for our provider members to see. You can access the demand portal where our providers list where they need property, so you can buy property to order. If you're a provider, you can access the property portal to see where our members have property available for you to lease, and you can list where you need property. We do not charge any additional introduction or sourcing fees. You also get access to our monthly training sessions with industry experts to help you understand supported living property and keep up to date. You get access to our monthly online networking sessions to help you connect with property investors and providers. I've written 2 training courses, one for providers and one for property investors, to help you get started in supported living property. We have a membership area filled with resources that you need, where you can watch the previous training sessions too. You get all of this for only £47.50 plus VAT a month. And because we do not want you to stay unless you think it's incredible value, you can leave at any time. Just give us 14 days notice. Simply go to www.supportedlivingproperty.uk. That's www.supportedlivingproperty.uk to join us now.